In the late 19th century, the nations of Europe were competing for overseas colonies in Africa and Asia. Many Americans thought that the United States should enter this game of empires and demonstrate its growing power in the world. However, the U.S. was still cognizant of its own colonial past. The American idea of representative democracy was defined in part by the colony's dissatisfaction with having to submit to a government located on the other side of the ocean, which led to their uprising against the British. Embracing the persona of an aloof dictator looked like a fundamental transgression of those values. At first, it looked as though the United States would not cave into the temptations of being an empire. When, in 1893, American sugar plantation owners engineered a coup to dethrone Hawaii's Queen Lili'uokalani and annex the Hawaiian Islands, the United States refused to cooperate with the underhanded scheme. Not long after the Hawaiian coup, disturbing news came from Cuba. In 1895, Cubans rose in rebellion against Spain for their independence, which had been in control of the island since the 1500s. Spain depended on Cuba for prestige and trade and used it as a training ground for its army. The Spanish rounded up Cubans and pushed them into reconcentration camps, where hygienic conditions and disease claimed thousands of lives in an effort to put an end to the insurrection. In a tactic known as yellow journalism, American newspapers, desperate to sell copies, used dramatic stories, both genuine and false, to incite public hysteria against the Spanish. They asserted that the downtrodden Cubans were enduring injustice at the hands of European despots, as the British had done prior to the American Revolution. Due to the protracted struggle and growing uncertainty regarding Cuba's future, the United States was suffering significant economic setbacks. Shipping companies that had previously benefited greatly from trade with Cuba were now losing money as a result of the unresolved issue. These businesses put pressure on President McKinley and Congress to put an end to the uprising. Other American businesses appealed to the Spanish to bring back order, particularly those who had made investments in Cuban sugar. Both interests wanted stability, not conflict. The ability of the United States and Spain to resolve their differences diplomatically would determine how stability was to be established. During the pandemonium, the U.S. sent the cruiser USS Maine into Havana Harbor to guard Americans and their interests there. The Maine detonated 9 days after it arrived, killing 266 American sailors. Despite the Spanish's allegation that the explosion originated on board the ship, the Americans were convinced that Spanish sabotage had destroyed the Maine. With public attention riveted on the situation and Spain not finding a diplomatic solution to avoid war, as it had earlier refused the United States' offer to negotiate between the Spanish and the Cubans, Spain appealed to the European powers, most of whom advised it to accept U.S. conditions for Cuba in order to avoid war. Germany urged a united European stand against the United States, but took no action. After a few abortive attempts at mediating the dispute, the United States declared war against Spain on April 11, 1898. The war was fought in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. In order to prevent the possibility of U.S. annexation of Cuba, Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which proclaimed that the United States would help the Cuban people gain their freedom from Spain, but would not annex the island after victory. That is, not to become a U.S. territory. The modern American warships were too powerful for the worn-out ruins of Spain's New World dominion. The Spanish Armada was swiftly destroyed by U.S. forces at sea. The Americans' conquest of the Philippines, a Pacific outpost of the Spanish Empire whose people were also revolting against Spanish control, caught the Spanish off guard. The conflict was not quite as simple on Cuban land. Most of the American armed forces were volunteers, and they lacked the proper gear for a tropical expedition. The Battle of San Juan was a decisive battle of the Spanish-American War. Future President Teddy Roosevelt, who had assembled a volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders, garnered fame for a charge upon the San Juan Heights, suffering heavy casualties that would have had little success were it not for the support of seasoned African-American soldiers serving in segregated infantry and cavalry units. With control of San Juan Heights overlooking the city of Santiago, American forces began the siege of the city on July 2nd. In May 1898, 1 month after the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, a Spanish fleet docked in the Santiago de Cuba harbor after racing across the Atlantic from Spain. A superior U.S. naval force arrived soon after and blockaded the harbor entrance. In June, the U.S. Army Fifth Corps landed on Cuba with the aim of marching to Santiago and launching a coordinated land and sea assault on the Spanish stronghold. In 6 weeks' time, U.S. forces were in control of the 2 major remaining Spanish possessions overseas, Cuba and the Philippines. Fearful that Japan might attempt to take control of Hawaii while the United States was distracted by Spain, President William McKinley also signed a resolution formally annexing Hawaii on July 7, 1898. Hawaii was now a U.S. territory. On August 12, 1898, war-weary Spain, whose empire was on the decline for centuries, signed an armistice. With less than 400 Americans lost in the Philippines, Secretary of State John Hay referred to the fighting as a splendid little war. Less admirable but hardly ever mentioned were the over 5,000 American fatalities from illnesses like yellow fever and malaria. Diplomats from Spain and the United States convened in the autumn and winter of 1898 in Paris to negotiate the terms of peace. Neither Cuban nor Filipino representatives were permitted to participate in the negotiations. Spain agreed to release Cuba and hand over Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States as part of the Treaty of Paris. Furthermore, because of delayed communications, the Spanish wanted the Philippines back, which the Americans had taken after the armistice on August 12th. The United States agreed to pay them $20 million for Manila to cover infrastructure owned by Spain. America had now become an empire. The 10-week war ended with the December 1898 Treaty of Paris, negotiated on terms favorable to the United States. The treaty ceded ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain to the United States and granted the United States temporary control of Cuba. Although the United States did not annex Cuba outright, it did force Cubans to recognize American control in their new constitution. In the Platt Amendment, Cuba agreed to permit American diplomatic, economic, and military intervention and to lease Guantanamo Bay for American use. The conclusion of the war was a bitter joke for the Filipino people, who had cooperated with U.S. forces to overthrow Spain. The Americans refused to grant the Filipinos their independence, even though they couldn't bear for the Philippines to be under Spanish rule. Politicians in the U.S. had the view that the Little Brown Brothers, as William H. Taft, the future president of the U.S., referred to them, were incapable of self-government. The Filipinos quickly realized they had exchanged one imperial power for another and revolted against the U.S. government. Ironically, the United States employed the same tactics that the Spanish had employed against the Cubans during their 2-year battle to quell the revolt in the Philippines. After the Americans crushed the rebels in 1901, the Philippines was annexed by the U.S. 10 times more U.S. troops died suppressing revolts in the Philippines than in defeating Spain. For Filipinos, though, it meant neither citizenship nor independence. As for Puerto Ricans, it meant they had American citizenship, eventually, but not self-rule. The Spanish-American War brought an end to almost 4 centuries of Spanish presence in the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific. The defeat and loss of the Spanish Empire's last remnants was a profound shock to Spain's national psyche and provoked a thorough philosophical and artistic re-evaluation of Spanish society, known as the Generation of '98. Led by novelists, poets, essayists, and thinkers. After the Spanish-American War, one thing was for sure: the U.S. would never be the same. After emerging from the Civil War as an industrial giant, it has endured for more than a century as an isolationist republic situated far from European powers by the ocean. After decisively defeating Spain and gaining a vast empire, the United States emerged as a significant force on the world stage. What to think of non-whites not capable of self-governance, and Cubans forced to recognize American control in their new constitution, permitting American diplomatic, economic, and military intervention in their country whenever? Drop your thoughts below, and let's continue to dive deeper into the currents of history together. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more on A Cup of History.